Hello bakers, welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. My name's Mark Floerke. I'm the host of the Baked in Science podcast on Bakerpedia. Today I want to continue with our discussion on product development. My colleague Gideon also was talking to you about ingredient substitution, and the product development process is something that can also be very well applied to ingredient substitution for evaluating or checking to confirm that it functions or tastes properly in the types of products that you're using. What I want to talk to you about is the idea of how to streamline this process a little bit. So first, I'm going to mention a little bit about thinking along the lines of a cake and a cake mix. And you want to now evaluate something to kind of see, what if you change the leavening system, or what if you change an emulsifier to get better, softer shelf life, or things like that. So rather than scaling everything up to make one mix and make a cake, and then make another mix and make a cake, and so you're scaling and scaling and scaling, one, this takes a lot of time to do. Secondly, which is even more important, the more frequent batches you have to scale, say if you had to scale 4, 5, or 6 different test batches, the more you are likely to introduce error and inconsistencies. So what we want to look at is how can we make this more homogeneous so that there are less inconsistencies, and so that it eliminates or reduces significantly the chances for error and gives us that ability to then change or adjust whatever it is we need to change. Most of the time in something like a cake mix, we would look to either the sugar or the flour as the largest bulk component that can rise and fall with the adjustment of minors. For example, if I wanted to make my cake mix without any milk powder in it, I could reduce the milk powder and increase the flour. Or I could increase the milk powder and reduce the flour, so that I can kind of see how that functions. They will trade out fairly well that way because the milk powder is a relatively minor ingredient, so that it will not have as big an impact in terms of just changing it to flour in terms of seeing those differences. Similarly, if I wanted to reduce or increase baking powder, I would do the same thing. I would reduce the flour, increase the baking powder, so that my formula always stays at 100%. And things along those lines. Or if I'm looking at an emulsifier, that is a little bit different. There you look at, even though the emulsifier is a small ingredient, but what is the emulsifier comprised of? And when we look at things like polyglycerol monoesters, like PGME, or monodiglycerides or distilled monoglycerides, these are fat-based systems. These are emulsifiers that are extracted from fat. So they are best combined with fat in the process. And we would then want to reduce the fat for the same amount of emulsifier that we are adding. We're going to look at a formula where there's lecithin in the formula, and so we will of course also take the lecithin out as we add an emulsifier in there. And I'm going to show you how we can use a spreadsheet to very quickly calculate all of these variances to come up with a big pre-blend that we then use an amount of for each mix and just add the missing parts. And those missing parts might be emulsifier, might be lecithin, might be a little bit of shortening, might be flour, and so on, right? And so you keep those all consistent, and that way you can run more than one mixer at a time if you have multiple mixers, or you can at least make them quickly back to back without having to rescale all of the ingredients again in between. So that instead of scaling flour 5 times for each batch, you scale the flour once for the premix and only the minor adjustments that you have to add for each batch for the variants. And we'll get to that. I'll share my screen, and that way you'll see how the Excel sheet works, right? And so with that, the other things then we'll talk about a little bit in a future Wisdom Wednesday is I'll then talk about also an evaluation sheet. Set yourself up for success in that what do you want to record? And even if the only thing you're looking at is cake volume, record everything else along the way as well, as much as you can, because sometimes these are like clues, like they are things that help you evaluate how the batter is performing. The batter temperature after mixing, observations of what the batter looks like. Is it smooth? Is it creamy? Is it curdled? Things like the specific gravity and so on. So we'll talk about that some more in the next Wisdom Wednesday when I'll continue our discussion on product development processes. Something that is often very overlooked as an easy way to do this quickly and to do it very precise and get good information. So let's switch over to the spreadsheet so you can see a little bit about what I am talking about. So here is my spreadsheet that I've started off and populated a little bit for you already. I hope this comes through fairly clear on the video. And so in this spreadsheet, this worksheet, it has some macros embedded. So if you request a copy, when you launch it, you do have to enable the macros. Don't worry, there are no hidden viruses or anything. It's just to allow the spreadsheet to function because I've put in a lot of automated shortcuts for this, right? So I've put in here the ingredients that I'm going to be using and looking at and evaluating in this cake mix. So I've got sugar, salt, shortening, lecithin. The emulsifier right now you can see here is 0. So that's going to be one of the things I'm going to be checking. Cake flour, baking powder, non-fat dry milk powder, water, eggs, and I also got oil as a 0 right now because I'm going to switch some of that out, some of the shortening out for oil as a way to evaluate in the process. These boxes here are for recording information such as if you have project numbers or to record the test objective and things along those lines. So I've entered in a base formula. And you could see I've entered it in percentages, in the formula percentages, and here at the bottom, it adds up to 100% in total, right? So here it is automated and is lighting up and saying flour, flour, flour. And it's not giving me any grams yet, okay? So first of all, what it's saying is to calculate baker's percent, you need to tell me which of these ingredients are flour, especially if there's more than one. In this case, there's only one flour, and you can see there's a column here titled flour. And so we go onto the line that is the cake flour in that column, and I'm going to put an X and hit enter. And so now it calculates all of my baker's percent for me. So you can see the cake flour is, of course, 100%, and everything else is in ratio to the cake flour in this formula, okay? You can see baking powder is very high at 9%. Non-fat dry milk is also very high at 9%. I would consider these very high values for a typical cake mix, right? It's typical for a high ratio. There's more sugar than there is flour. This can be anywhere from 100 to 140% in a high ratio cake mix, but we still have no grams. And that is because we have to say, well, what size is our sample going to be? And that happens up here in that green cell where it says test sample size. So we're going to make 500 grams of batter in each batch so that we have enough for 400 to go in a cake pan and then batter left over for doing specific gravity and batter flow, a Bostwick, for example, right? So I'm going to type 500 grams here. And so now you can see it calculates and populates. That's how much would have to be scaled for batch 1, okay? So here you can see it's highlighting yellow and in terms of that these are all different from what the first formula is, right? And so I'm going to take these values here and I'm going to copy them and paste them as values right here. And so I have the same values. But what I'm going to do is, in this one, for example, I'm going to reduce the lecithin to 0. And I'm going to reduce the shortening to 11%. And then I'm going to put my emulsifier blend in as 1.2%, which ends up being pretty high. It's 5.4% of the flour. That might be a bit high, but it's a good place to start, right? So we could see what has changed between Formula 1 and 2 is that the shortening is less, and there's the addition of the emulsifier blend, and there is the removal of the lecithin, okay? And so now I'm going to scroll along and do a third one for you, just so that it's easier for you to visualize what is happening here, okay? And again, I'm going to copy and paste this information. I'm going to copy those numbers, and I'm going to paste them as values. And so the other thing I wanted to do here is I wanted to start adding some vegetable oil. Right? So in my batch, I want to use probably about, I'm going to say about 10% vegetable oil, okay? And of course now it's 110, so that's too high. So because it's oil, I'm taking it out of the shortening. I'm only going to use 1% solid shortening. So then it's back to 100. So now we could see there's a difference here. Is it changed that there's only 5 grams of shortening instead of 55 or 60, and there's 50 grams of oil instead of 0. And I've left the emulsifier blend in number 3, so that I'm evaluating one change at a time. I'm not doing both changes here. I do one change is the emulsifier blend. The second change is the I'm changing shortening for vegetable oil, and then I can compare between the control and the two changes what changes. So now to make this all work, I can put names for what these are as a reference to clarify. Here I want to click on these boxes and say that these formulas are active, so that I have 1, 2, 3 formulas active. So if you look up here, it says premix percentage of, and it says 1,530 grams, 3 sets. That's because it takes the 500, multiplies it by the number of sets, and adds a little shrink factor for what you might lose in mixing. So if I turn it off, you could see it says there's only 2 sets, but we want 3 sets. So now we need to go back to the left side of the spreadsheet, and we now need to say, what do we want as dry premix? And if we want a wet premix, we can make that too, okay? And so our dry premix, I want to put, and we just put X's beside it. So I want to put sugar in my dry premix, and I want salt in there, and the shortening, and I'm going to put not the lecithin or the emulsifier blend. They would come up as 0 anyway, so I can show you that, because I'll explain in a moment why. And then the cake flour, and then the baking powder, the water, the eggs, oh, sorry, that's the water, non-fat dry milk powder, water, eggs, and vegetable oil. So now the vegetable oil is showing 10% in the dry premix, which it really shouldn't. And that's because I neglected to put in the amount here. And 0 is an amount, and a blank cell is not. So I have to put 0 here, and there you can see it now shows up as 0 in the dry premix. Right? I could, of course, also remove the vegetable oil from the dry premix and use it in a wet, but since we only have one mix here, with oil in it, we won't be doing that. I just wanted to do that to show you those differences. So this is going to look for the smallest value amongst them and calculate a 1,500 gram batch. So this is how much you would scale each of these once in that time, blend it all up, and then you can see the differences that you add. In batch number 1, we add 55 grams of shortening and 1 gram of lecithin, plus 444 grams of premix, and then that will make up our total mixture for the 500 grams, right? The water, of course, doesn't go in the dry premix. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to mislead you there. I don't mean to confuse anyone. There we go. So you see 264 dry premix, 100 grams of water, 80 grams of whole egg, and so on. And so you could see that goes across for the 3 batches. So here we add 50 grams of shortening, 6 grams of the emulsifier blend, water and eggs. Here we just add only the emulsifier blend and water and eggs and vegetable oil. Okay, so and this allows you to streamline that so that you can scale this all once, blend it, then just scale out this dry premix for each batch and add the ingredients to it. Very quick and simple, very consistent this way to allow you to do consistent batches. And you can carry on with these. I've made this spreadsheet with up to 6 batches. And what you would do is you would save this, whatever your project name is, so that you retain the blank one, and then you can keep making new sheets every time. So that allows you to use the spreadsheet to very quickly organize your product development on an ingredient research. I was showing you with essentially an idea of looking at 2 ingredients, being the fat and the emulsifier. You could do this with multiple ingredients. You could do it just with 1 ingredient looking through. Let's say, for example, if you wanted to evaluate just shortening and you have 6 different shortenings to evaluate. Well, you leave the shortening out of the dry premix, and that way you scale the premix and just add the amount of shortening to each batch. Then you can evaluate all 6 all in one shot very quickly. Saves you a lot of time, but most importantly, it keeps things very, very consistent so that it removes the margin of error in weighing ingredients, because that's when most of the mistakes happen. So that's your Wisdom Wednesday for today. I hope you found this informative. Please drop me a line at mark.floerke@bakerpedia.com if you're interested in the worksheet, and I'll be happy to email that out to you. Take care for now. Have a great week.